Hello, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mia Burke, and I am Program Manager with Hanford Challenge. Hanford Challenge is a nonprofit based in Seattle that works on cleanup of the Hanford nuclear site and works closely with whistleblowers to ensure their voices are safely heard. This is the 5th webinar of our Nuclear Waste Scholar Series. We started the Nuclear Waste Scholar Series to inspire action and involvement with Hanford cleanup by inviting movers, shakers, and thinkers to share groundbreaking scholarship, art, research, and experience working with nuclear waste. Kathleen's presentation is starting off our Artist Series, in which we will be hearing from various writers and artists who use different mediums to explore nuclear waste. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Kathleen Flanagan. Kathleen is a former Washington State Poet Laureate and grew up in Richland, Washington, near Hanford. Kathleen is the author of 3 books of poetry, Post-Romantic, Plume, and Famous. Her awards include a Pushcart Prize and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and Artists Trust. Kathleen teaches poetry through arts agencies like Writers in the Schools and Jack Straw. For 13 years, she was an editor at Floating Bridge Press and currently serves on the board of Jack Straw, an audio arts studio and cultural center. Kathleen holds a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing from Pacific Lutheran University, as well as bachelor's and master's degrees in civil engineering. Just as a heads up, Kathleen's presentation will be about 45 minutes long, and we will leave 30 minutes after the presentation for Q&A. If you can't stick around for the whole time, feel free to hop off. We will be recording the presentation and will share a link of the recording with everyone who registered. For everyone listening in, please put your questions in the chat or use the Q&A feature. We'll have time to answer questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kathleen. I'll pass it to you to talk about your poetic connection to place.
Thank you, Mia. I want to say thank you to Mia and Liz for inviting me to be part of this program. I think it's great that you're doing these lunchtime talks. Let's get me going here. So ordinarily when I present my poems, it's just me standing up in an audience and I just read the poems to you. But because there's a screen between me and you, I thought it would be useful for me to put together some photographs. These are a lot of historical photographs of Hanford. And also I'm actually showing you the poems that I'm going to read, so you can read along with me if that's helpful. Almost all of these poems come from my book Plume, which was published by University of Washington Press in 2012. And it's a book that it took me about 8 years to put together. I think of the poems in phases. The first poems I wrote were memoir poems. They're poems about my childhood and growing up and my best friend's father dying of a radiation illness. The second section was more poems based in research. So I actually started reading, and a lot of those poems were inspired by Michelle Gerber's book, On the Home Front, which I highly recommend. And then the final section were the poems that were the hardest to write. They're the ones that were trying to make sense of what I learned. So I'm going to share some of those poems with you today. As Mia said, I was born in Richland, Washington. In 1960, I was the youngest of 3 kids. My dad was a PhD chemist and worked out at GE and then at Battelle. We grew up on Cottonwood Drive, right where Cedar comes into it. So this picture down here is actually a picture of Cedar Avenue. This is before my time. By the time I was around, those trees were much, much bigger, but I love the feel of this picture and the newness of it and the heat. You can almost feel the heat. And this picture over here of the little, almost like toy houses. This is Richland when it was young. And Richland was a great place to grow up. Now, when I was a kid, I would hear this word atomic all around me. There were the Atomic Lanes bowling alley, and there was the atom on top of the Uptown Theater marquee. I knew what an atom looked like, and I knew that word. And I associated with positive things. To me, atomic meant space age, and it meant new and improved, and it meant scientific. I often heard Richland referred to by people who lived there as a scientific community, and that was clearly a positive. It was all positive. So when I was about 7 years old, we traveled to Portland to visit my cousins, and they had a brand new color television set, which was very exciting at the time. We only had black and white TV. And I have this very strong memory of standing in front of the TV set while everybody's sort of visiting and running around behind me. And I saw this violent orange explosion on the color television that looked a lot like this picture. And I heard someone say that it was an atomic bomb. And I had never heard atomic and bomb together like that. And I'd never seen anything like this explosion before. And though I didn't know anything, on some level, I understood that Richland was somehow involved in this explosion. And sure enough, later, as I grew old enough to kind of understand, that came around. So this first poem I want to share with you is a poem about that moment of encountering the bomb for the first time. And if you see the poem, just looking at it on the page, I centered it so it kind of looks like an atomic bomb, like a mushroom cloud with a reflection below it. And I've written this poem in a form called a palindrome poem. So it's the same line by line going forward as it is going backward. So there's a kind of dividing line in the middle. And I felt like this was a very appropriate form for that moment of understanding, a kind of loss of innocence. So everything that I thought I knew before and everything I thought I knew afterwards. Afternoon's wide horizon. That mushroom cloud filling my cousin's color TV stained orange what remained black and white at home. The atomic age had been a fond friend where I lived in Atomic City. The atom had something to do with who I was. Now the sky on screen filled with fire. What is that? I asked. What is that? I asked the sky on screen filled with fire. Who I was now had something to do with where I lived in Atomic City. The atom, the atomic age, had been a fond friend. What remained black and white at home? My cousin's color TV stained orange, that mushroom cloud filling afternoon's wide horizon. So I did learn the story of the Manhattan Project eventually. I don't know exactly when I became aware of that. And I would, if you talk to residents of Richland, kids who grew up there, you'll hear different stories about when they learned what Hanford really was. It was a mixed bag, but I did eventually learn that it was part of the Manhattan Project. And then I learned the story, which is really a triumphant story about how this site was created in secret and the way that they made the first plutonium, the first full-scale reactors in the world, and that the plutonium from that site was used in the Nagasaki bomb, which actually ended the World War II. So this story is a really triumphant one, and I think of it as a creation story. Just like the biblical creation story, it's about an awesome power, and it's about our collective loss of innocence, the consequences of that. But most important, it explains to us who we were and why we were there, why we were in this little dusty, remote area. Now, when I was growing up, I felt and became more aware of articles in the newspaper. And then as the site closed down and then they started cleaning up, all these pictures and stories about the largest contaminated waste site in our hemisphere and the largest largest environmental cleanup in the world. And so there was this duality. It was the place where I grew up, my hometown, the good schools, the big pool, my friends, my parents' friends, And then there was this other story, which was like world history. And it was very hard to kind of hold the two together in my mind, which is where poems come from. I found this quote very recently, and I'm really happy that I found it because it expresses something for me. When I started writing my poems, this is 20 years after I moved away from Richland, I had all these people sort of saying, oh, you must be so angry. And I did try to write angry poems because I felt betrayed, right? And so anger and betrayal go together hand in hand. And yet I wasn't finding those poems really expressing what I felt. So Robert Frost said that poetry is about grief, the grief, politics is about the grievance. So grievance and grief, they're different. And so my poems in general tend to have the tone of grief or sadness. And that's where I kind of landed with the poems. They're transformed. They're a transformation of those raw feelings that I had. This is a poem I've written more recently. It's in my book, Post Romantic, about that moment, about the story after the story. So even though we only told ourselves the story of the Manhattan Project and the end of World War II, there's that long story that happens afterward. And there's the story of that contamination. So that's this one, Story That Won't End Well. It begins in a laboratory under a football field. While the axis rolls over distant continents, 50,000 nomads journey to the American West to construct cathedrals in the desert for Nobel physicists, performing feats they're not privileged to understand, to microscopic tolerances in dust storms, the stuff of legend. Periscopes and code words, train cars loaded with uranium, the heroism of a just war, all prologue to the story we can't see, smell, or taste, that seeps underground and drifts undetected downstream and downwind, while the Soviets match us bomb for bomb, while we build lives and more reactors, pledge allegiance, defend the key, plant birches in the yard, and a naga hide couch in the family room. Our story develops invisibly, incrementally, until one afternoon it daylights in town square, and we force ourselves to read it bubbling there, the ugly, stinking, bitter truth. And some fall down, and some go home unmoved. I wanted to tell you a little bit about what it was like to be a child in Richland in the 60s and 70s. I think one universal truth was that almost all of us had a parent or sometimes two parents that worked out at what we called the area. And in the mornings, you would see these buses come through town and they'd pick up people. Like my best friend Carolyn lived 4 houses up the street. Her dad worked out in the 100 areas. So he'd grab the bus right in front of our house with his lunch pail. My dad put on a suit and tie. He worked out at 300 areas. So he would drive his car. But one universal fact was that they would go away in the morning, they'd come back in the evening, and no one ever talked about work. I think we were kind of charmed by that about ourselves, that made us different than other towns. We just didn't talk about it. And that idea was inculcated not just in the people who worked out there, but their families too. It was actually taken up by all of us. And so even as children, we didn't always talk about it directly, but we had the sense that we were carrying the secrecy as well. And that was part of our job. And it just kind of is in the air. It's sort of insidious, and but it set us apart, and its part contributes to that feeling of a us against the world mentality, which we had growing up, that we were we were an us, and the rest of the world was a them. I like to put up this photograph by John Clement, who's a wonderful Tri-Cities area photographer, because I think of it as kind of a litmus test. I mean, do you think this is a beautiful picture? I mean, it's a very dramatic picture, definitely. And I can see the beauty in it now, sort of from a distance. But when I grew up in Richland, I didn't really love the way it looked. I didn't love the desert. I loved trees. I loved water. And I always felt a little bit like a fish out of water. And I think there's something more serious to that element of this too, which is that people came to the Tri-Cities, they came to Richland, they worked at Hanford from somewhere else. And they often would look at this place as a kind of wasteland or an empty place, which gave them permission to do terrible things to the land. I really honestly feel that was part of how this site got chosen in the first place, because it looked empty, even though there were people living there. And so the landscape, I think, is a big part of why Hanford is Hanford. Now, the town was built during World War II, and the houses are very simple, very practical. Richland is not a beautiful town. The library, when I was growing up, was in a Quonset hut. There were tumbleweeds tumbling through town under my bedroom window. People would, the trees were slowly growing up along the streets, but people would sometimes cut their trees down and put like white rocks in their yards, which I never understood. So it wasn't a beautiful place, but it was a great place to live. And part of that were these houses, which we called alphabet houses. I lived in the one on the right-hand side. I live in a ranch house just like that. And I lived in this, my room was the bedroom 3, which is this window right here, except reversed. One of the things I loved about Richland is that I'd go to a friend's house and I knew exactly where the bathroom was. I knew what the house layout was. It was fun to see which room was my friend's room. That all felt very familiar. But also there was this egalitarian quality to it that, for instance, my father had a PhD in chemistry, and our next door neighbor had an 8th grade education, and we lived in identical houses. There was this evenness, and nobody talked about work at school. So when you were at school, you were on your own. You were smart, or you were fast, or you were pretty, or you were athletic, and you made your way on your own, not on whether your dad had a great job or you wore fancy clothes. That none of that was in the equation. So that middle class, sort of classless society was very comfortable and very great. Now, granted, this was a monoculture that I grew up in. Everyone was young. There were our parents and there were us, and there were no older people. There was almost entirely white population. There are very, very few African Americans in our community. So there was a sameness, it felt great at the time, but you looking back, you see it quite differently. This is just some kind of fun things. The Spudnut shop, which was always a great place to go and still is. People go and hang out there and play cards and visit. And I love that picture of the fish and chips. That was before my time, but I just think it's funny. And then the picture of the cinnamon roll is just to acknowledge this epic public school lunch menu item. Every week they would serve chili con carne and homemade cinnamon rolls, which were the most popular lunch item always, every week. So that was kind of a fun thing too. I'm not going to read this poem, but I did want to acknowledge that another touchstone was the mosquito truck that would come through the city on summer evenings. And I've heard a story by a contemporary of mine that he would run around behind, on his bike. He would chase the mosquito truck all over town with these big DDT clouds coming out behind it. And then he would go home and take off his t-shirt and sleep with his face buried in his t-shirt because he loved the smell of the DDT. Just a cautionary tale. He's still alive to tell the story. And then this one is one I do remember firsthand, which is the mobile whole body counter. So when I was in about kindergarten, this trailer came to our school, and every child in our school and in every school in Richland went through the whole body counter. I didn't see this photo until very recently, but I think it's kind of amazing picture. And they happen to be, I think they're probably doing Ring Around the Rosie, Ashes to Ashes, We All Fall Down. And again, this photo was new to me too. I actually know one of those girls on the bench. I was in ballet class with her for years. And I'm kind of pleased because I wrote this poem about the experience of going through the whole body counter without seeing a photo of it. So I'm quite pleased because it kind of lines up pretty well with what I remember. So I'll begin with an epigraph from Health Physics magazine. The mobility of this new laboratory provides versatile capabilities for measuring internally deposited gamma ray emitting radionuclides in human beings. Whole body counter, Marcus Whitman Elementary. We were warned to shut our eyes. Everyone was school age now, our kindergarten teacher reminded us, old enough to follow directions and do a little for our country. My turn came and the scientist strapped me in and a steady voice prompted, the counter won't hurt, lie perfectly still. And mostly I did and imagined what children pretend America is. Parks bordered by feathery evergreens, lawns so green and lush, they soothe the eyes and pupils open like love. A whole country of lawns like that. Just once I peeked and the machine had taken me in like a spaceship and I moved slow as the sun through the chamber's smooth steel sky. I shut my eyes again and pledged to be still, so proud to be a girl America could count on. So after I finished school in Richland, I went off to Washington State University and I got a degree in civil engineering. And at that time, it was very hard to find work. So I ended up doing what I didn't expect to do, which was to take a job at Hanford, working for Rockwell Hanford at the time. And that hadn't been the plan, but I have to say there was something very symbolic about it because when I was growing up, I saw all these adults wearing their badges and the badge has a photo on the front and a dosimeter on the back. And I remember my dad showing me that and showing me how that would read how much radiation you were exposed to. And here I was given my own badge, my own dosimeter. It was almost like, here, you are actually an adult now. Here is your badge to prove you're an adult. And going out to the site was like learning a secret handshake. You know, I was taking the bus to the 200 areas, which is about a 40-minute drive. And I was actually getting to see the site on my own. So this poem is about that very first day. And it's about the informational video about all the various alarms and learning the alarms. And though I was very, accustomed to the Richland mentality, and I knew Hanford in a sense, you'll sense in this poem the fear. There was fear in me too about going out to this site. Siren recognition, Hanford, 1983. The orientation video begins with fire and hurricane, familiar, comfortable disaster. Then, with a queer segue, the awooga of commencing reactor meltdown. I sit in my summer suit from Nordstrom, the only new hire today, not dressed for fear in the shape of a mushroom cloud or the end of the human race. The clerk sorts through papers as though this is any workday. I believe in her eyeshadow, the orange on her desk, but the siren sounds deep in my lizard brain, in my involuntary heart, which has stopped and locked, the way security, explains a calm voice in the video, will lock down the gates and my chicken body run in circles as my severed future fries. Hear the siren once and it will change your life. That night, I'll wake transformed into a cockroach, scaling the inside of a reactor dome. It was really meaningful to me to be able to go out to the site after growing up next to it all my life and to actually see with my own eyes some of the wildlife that I'd heard about, to see the ghost towns. That really was meaningful for me. I loved it. And then to visit, I eventually wound up in the 200 West area, and to be driving among these canyon buildings, which I'd only seen from a distance from the highway, and to see how old and kind of imposing they are. And I was starting to learn this expression, need to know. So there was this information sharing was only on a need to know basis between organizations inside Hanford. There was also a sense that you don't go driving around places you don't belong. So you don't just go investigating. You have to know why you're any place that you are, and you have to have a reason. So it's very interesting. I really enjoyed Vince Pinesco's talk about the ancient lake beds. He was describing work that I actually worked on. I worked for an organization called the Hydrogeology Unit, which was out in the 200 West area. And we monitored the groundwater movement from the mounding underneath the 200 areas as it was moving towards the Columbia River and pushing contaminants towards the Columbia River. So that was our work. And we also would monitor the installation of new liquid waste disposal sites. We would put in new monitoring wells. We looked at surface water ponds. So that was our work, and it was wonderful work. I felt that it was important, and I loved what I was doing. You can see on the picture on the left is a typical soil column log, or a geologic log that would have been mapped out by a geologist sitting on a drill rig as they're digging the well, and monitoring and marking down all the different sediments, including those ancient lake beds, which we didn't call it that in the day, but we acknowledged them. And so I wanted to create a poem. I always have had a wish to write an engineering poem, and I never knew how to do it. And this is my engineering poem. So poets think a lot about form. And since you're able to see the poem, I want to point out a few things about it. First of all, it looks like it's 2 columns, but I want you to think of it as one long column, because it just didn't fit on the page. One long skinny poem. And I left and right justified it so that it has the straight edges of a well or a soil column. And in doing that, it separates the words out so that there's these spaces between words. And you can think of that as the voids between soil particles. So it actually introduces an avenue for those contaminants to start flowing down through and down. And one of the reasons I made the poem so skinny was that actually moves your eye down the page very quickly. So you feel a kind of the pressure of your eye going down the page. You can think of the contaminants going down the page. And then one last thing to point out is I use the language of engineering. So I use words like adsorption and gradient and permeable and impermeable. These are all words that we used on a daily basis in the work that I did. So, poets think a lot about form, and I had a lot of information I was trying to get across. So I was asking my poems forms to help tell some of the story for me. So, plume. For years, it may be locked in the matrix of silt and sand, like a photographic image, still and untransported, absorbed and adsorbed. Then the introduction of gradient to unsaturated soils, percolation, and it awakens, unfurling like a frond, a carpet unrolling itself, remote, underground. This beautiful movement fanning between interstices, feathering void to void, describes the dark earth, the layering of permeable and impermeable soils. It is out of our hands, this 50-year-old mistake, this poison. Yes, it is moving to the river. Yes, it migrates between grains, down to saturated sediment, manifestly down. And when it descends as far as it can, it will swim, ride droplets like swan boats, float, spread, diffuse, distend, trailing its delicate paisley scarf. And like anything with a destiny, a flock of birds, sperm, breath. It will move downstream to the river. Yes, the river will take it in. So I commented on this a little bit, but this idea of need to know was overpowering in the work I did at Hanford. And I felt very good about the people I worked with. I trusted them. I knew they were ethical. I saw good work being done there. But there's that, but then there's this lack of communication between various aspects of the site. And I always felt like there was a lack of information. It was very hard to get information. And it had a sense that we didn't all know what was going on. And that's not good for science. It just isn't. So that's something I took away from me. And I always felt really uncomfortable about that. So, you create this site with 9 nuclear reactors and contamination, and there are going to be consequences for that. And that became very personal for me. My best friend Carolyn up the street, her dad was a laborer out at the site for many decades, and he started to fall ill and didn't know what it was. And eventually he got a diagnosis at University Hospital in Seattle, and they told him that he had a very rare blood condition that they had only seen and it was very rare, only seen in people who had, survived Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And so it looked like his work, emptying out train cars and drilling, making slugs, fuel slugs, and cleaning out the reactors that it had caught up with him. One thing that's really upsetting to me is that he took this information back to the doctors at Hanford, and they suggested that maybe this had been due to his exposure to farm chemicals when he was a kid. So this is a guy who was the president of his labor union. He had worked tough jobs nobody else wanted to do. But he was also the guy that took us camping in the Blue Mountains, and he called Carolyn Tootie, and he tumbled rocks in the garage, and he had a canoe. And so this is a man that I knew and loved, and he was a tough guy, and he had this great big truck, and on the back of the truck his bumper sticker read, "More people have died in Ted Kennedy's car than in nuclear accidents." So this is the man who fell ill and eventually hired a lawyer and told Carolyn that he thought he had trusted the wrong people. And, for me, looking on and trying to make sense of this, it doesn't allow me to have this sort of rosy picture of my childhood. I did have a wonderful childhood. That's undeniable, but it wasn't the truth that I believed in, wasn't the truth. And there's this unyielding quality to the Hanford loyal. They say there's no radiation casualties. Well, I can't hold that as a truth when I know that my best friend's father died of a radiation illness. So it did a number on my head. And that's partly why I'm writing these poems, to try to make sense of what this means and who I am. It's part of my identity. So I want to share this poem with you for Carolyn's father, in part because it demonstrates in the poem this hand-in-hand quality of the town of Richland and Hanford. So it's a memory I have of being asked in 3rd grade to write a letter to President Nixon to ask him to keep the reactors open. So that's kind of gives you a sense of how tangled up the city and the site were. I also want to point out this picture on the right, which is not a picture of Mr. Dean. It's just a picture I found in the declassified document portal, but I just think it's a beautiful, beautiful photo, and a very evocative photo. He's putting on his whites, and men in the back putting on their whites. I just think it's stunning. To Carolyn's father, Thomas Jerry Dean, 1929 to 1988. On the morning I got plucked out of third grade by Principal Wellman because I'd written on command an impassioned letter for the life of our nuclear plants that the government threatened to shut down. And I put on my rabbit-trimmed green plaid coat because it was cold and I'd be on the televised news overseeing delivery of several hundred pounds of mail onto an airplane bound for Washington, D.C., addressed to President Nixon, who obviously didn't care about your job. At the same time, inside your marrow, blood cells began to err, one moment efficient, the next a few gone wrong, stunned by exposure to radiation, as you milled uranium into slugs, or swabbed down train cars, or reported to B reactor for a quick run in, run out. And by that morning, Mr. Dean, the poisoning of your blood had already begun. So, this truth forces me to look back at my childhood with a new lens. That sort of carefree childhood is tinged with this idea of what was going on and what we weren't aware of. I also want to point out the woman on the far left, that is my principal, Mrs. Wellman. So that's where poems come from. They come from that tension, and the tension doesn't go away. I'm still working through it. Okay, so I described how some of these poems were built on research, and this is one of those poems. This is based on reading I did in Michelle Gerber's book On the Home Front, and this I got from a story about the work they were doing going out to the Richland dock, which is a public dock in the city, and querying fishermen about how many fish they were eating because they were trying to quantify their exposure. So I kept thinking about, okay, there's somebody wrote this report, actually lives in Richland. So he's asking these questions of people who might be his next door neighbor or people down the street. So that's kind of the genesis of this poem. Richland Dock, 1956. Someone launched a boat into the current, caught and delivered fish to the lab, and someone tested for beta and P32. Someone with flasks and test tubes tested and retested to double check the rising values. And someone drove to the public dock with a clipboard and tallied species and weight, chatting with his neighbors. Which fish are you keeping? How many do you eat? And someone with a slide rule and a pool of light figured and refigured the radionuclide dose. Too high. Experimented frying up hot white fish. No, no. Then someone decided all the numbers were wrong. Someone from our town. Is that why we were never told? Well, someone fishing, that little boy, the teacher on Cedar Street, caught his limit and never knew. So I do feel like the secrecy that we were so good about keeping was partly what did us in a sense, that caused so many problems that it didn't need to. And I look at this billboard, silence means security, and obviously this is aimed at that worker, protection for all, don't talk. He's protecting his children. But what I want you to understand is that those children behind the window, they felt that too. They felt the necessity for being silent as well. And it was a whole social, cultural element that it was like at the core of who we were. I wanted to kind of express that secrecy in some way. And again, I turned to form to help me tell the story. So I used a form called the blackout poem. And a blackout poem takes a piece of text and then you black out the parts you don't want, and what remains is your poem. So that seems to go hand in hand with this idea of redacted, declassified documents. I also was fascinated by the way the AEC would tell Hanford over and over again, you don't have to be so secret. You can be more open about this. It's better for the science. And yet the Hanford personnel would come back by saying, no, we need to keep it secret. So I'm trying to tell that story using the redaction. Redaction 1. The dissemination of scientific and technical information relating to atomic energy should be permitted and encouraged so as to provide the free interchange of ideas and criticisms which is essential to scientific progress. The Atomic Energy Act of 1946. And the redacted message is, fear could end a critical scientific program. So this is my last poem that I'm going to share. There's a bit of a story that goes with this. So during that last period when I was trying to make sense of, I didn't have a full manuscript yet. I was still working on what to make of what I had learned. I took a trip to Washington, D.C., and I visited the Museum of American History. And it was just actually a coincidence. I didn't even know it was there. I went downstairs and found an exhibit called Science and Society. And I stepped into it, and usually it's about Los Alamos. I thought there'd be something about the Manhattan Project. I'm just suspicious of that. And usually it's just Los Alamos or maybe Oak Ridge. It's never Hanford. It's never about Hanford. But this was a whole room, a whole exhibit about Hanford, which I know it included a panel, like a control panel from one of the reactors. I think it was D reactor. And I walked up, and behind glass, there was a t-shirt from my high school, Richland Bombers, with the big mushroom cloud emblem. I had a t-shirt just like that. So it's like, imagine going into the Smithsonian and seeing your high school t-shirt behind glass. I mean, it was crazy. So I wandered around there, and I was in there for probably over an hour, even though it wasn't a very big room, because it wasn't just because I was interested in what I saw. I was fascinated to see how other people would interpret it. I watched other people surreptitiously, like, what does she think? What does he think when he looks at that? What is he believing? What is he reading? And it's basically, you're reading about my life here. What do you think? And so I lingered there for a very long time. And then when I was finally had my fill, I turned a corner, and there was a whole wall of photographs of Nagasaki victims. And so this poem is about that experience. And I'll end with this. Museum of Doubt, Nagasaki photos. My love, allow yourself to stall just a little, then enter the collection of black and white victims. Like ink blots, they await your reply. Focus, I'm holding your hand. Their shadows on bridges and walls stop at 11:02 like interrupted sundials. That, at least, you can respond to. You'll never make sense of rubble. The raw body proves difficult braille. Illness you can fathom, with its slippers scuffing along a glassy hall. But can you feel it? A kimono pattern imparted to the wearer's skin. Beloved, you've been carefully trained. Do you sense your resistance? Meaning is lost between the vulnerable eye and well-defended mind. Who's on your side, you keep asking? Not righteousness, not at this late hour. Look at you, unsure, but sure underneath. So I want to say thank you so much for listening. And if you do have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them for you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for sharing your story of growing up in Hanford or Richland, and then just the poetry that beautifully complements it. It was such an honor to have you speak today.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
And I think if you could stop sharing your screen. Yeah, great. And then if anyone wants to put questions in the chat or the Q&A, we can start asking Kathleen your questions. And I hope everyone has access to the Q&A. Please let me know if you do not. Steve Olson asks, are you still writing poems about Hanford?
So I do have that. I have a couple of Hanford related poems in my third book, Post Romantic. I read one of them. I had a poem that was really, it's not about Hanford, but it's about the testing out in the Bikini Islands. A story I learned at a conference where I actually met Steve Olson for the first time in Richland, about these test animals they put out, and then they exploded the bomb above ground, and to see what happened to the animals. So I have a poem about that, a poem about our fathers being going away and coming back. So, but I think it's, I should never say never, but I'm doing less and less of that and more about other things. So that was a really important part of my writing life for a long time, like a decade of my life. But I think I'm sort of moving on to other subjects.
Ryan asks, what inspired or drove you to tell your Hanford experiences through poetry?
Well, I didn't start writing so I have a degree in engineering. I worked at Hanford. I came back, I moved to Seattle to get married, and then I got a master's degree in engineering, and I worked in consulting for about 3 or 4 more years. And then we had our second son. So, I ended up leaving engineering, but it was when the kids were little, I started writing. So I didn't start writing poems until my early 30s. And the first 10 years of my writing life, I was writing about being at home and domestic life and raising children and my parents passing away, that, very kind of ordinary small things. And that's what my first book was about. And then when my second book, or, when I was ready to write another book, I felt like I was writing the same poems over and over again, but not as well. And I knew that there was this subject behind me. This, we lived through this loss of Carolyn's father. A lot of this was going on in my mind. And while it was a very scary subject, I thought, I think I need to try to tackle that. And I would say partly to give me, a direction for my writing life. But I think more importantly, I needed this to help me figure out what I thought. It helps me make sense of this push and pull in my brain. And that's where poetry comes from, that tension. So it was perfect fodder for writing. And I thought I would just write a few poems, and then I wrote more. And then, as I said, it was like a 3-part thing. So I wrote my poems, then I wrote research poems, and then I wrote sort of making sense of it poems.
Okay. Have you any thoughts on how to better inform the public and support cleanup by congressional funding?
Oh God, that's so one thing to tell you is that when I was poet laureate, this book had just come out. So I was reading from it a lot, and you would be shocked to know, or maybe you wouldn't, to know how many people who live in Washington state have never even heard of Hanford, or don't know what Hanford is, or don't know that it's a cleanup, or don't know anything. And so I don't know if that's part of the legacy of the secrecy. It shouldn't be secret anymore. And the people that work out there now, I think, should be very proud of the work they do. It's very important. Hanford Challenge is doing a great job of getting the work out, the word out and the truth out. But I just wish that we could get other parts of the country interested in this. It's just, I feel like it's so remote. That's one of the problems of it. It's like, it's easy for us not to care about it. That's why they put it out here to begin with. It's all part and parcel of the same thing, So I'm afraid I don't know, but I wish we could get it to be a more national story. Mm-hmm. My God, so much of our national money, our tax money needs to go there. So it should be followed by a larger audience.
Yeah, there's a question that ties into that a bit. Have you ever met someone that learned about Hanford through your poems? And if so, what did they say?
Well, yeah, I have had that. And a lot of people are moved by the story. And I've also had my contemporaries get in touch with me, people I grew up with, or people who grew up in a similar situation, maybe not the same age, but they, you know, they find the poems and they're really, it helps them find a voice for what they're feeling too. So it's this sense of connection, like I lived that too, I've been feeling that too. So that's what art's for. It helps us kind of galvanize our feelings. It also is supposed to help build empathy. You know, that's the word empathy actually comes from the idea of encountering art and what you feel when you're looking at art. That's where that word comes from. And so I'm always hoping that that empathy will grow and that people will be more concerned about the site because of that.
Yeah, I hope so too. Have you ever done readings of your poems in the Richland area, and how did locals respond, or how have friends of yours from your childhood responded?
The friends have been very grateful, and acquaintances, that's been a very positive experience. My experiences reading in Richland have been wonderful. I've had people thank me for the readings. I used to take around a Speakers Bureau presentation that was called A Child of Hanford. It was about a lot of what slides you saw today were taken from that presentation I used to give. And it was really a cultural presentation. It was about what it was like growing up there and this idea of learning a new truth about where I grew up. And those encounters, I had one in Kennewick that was a little frosty. There were people there that were not happy with what I was saying. But generally speaking, the vast majority are very positive. And the generation that this really belonged to, my parents' generation, they're all basically gone now, or they're very, you know, they're kind of removed from it. So the people that I see now are really more likely to be involved in the cleanup of this place. So they have a different perspective on the site, I think, and that's protective of them. And so I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. So much of what you talked about today was incredible and poignant, as Samar said. Oh, I'm reading. They're just lovely comments to you. So please read through the chat.
I see
from Liz, can you talk about your experience living in Seattle and talking with family, friends, community there about your life in Richland as you worked on your poetry?
Yeah, I was worried when I was writing these poems, how am I going to present them? Because you have to know the whole story. So I've been sort of a fount of information, maybe practicing on my local friends, you know, telling them what I know. How much do you need to know as I'm writing this? Does this make any sense? What kind of, you know, surroundings do you need for these poems? So the people who didn't know the story so well were actually very helpful for me as I was writing the poems, because they could tell me what they didn't understand and what they did understand. And so that was helpful. I do feel like when I'm reading these poems in the Seattle area, it feels much less loaded. And I do feel like I'm doing a little information talk for them, you know, even though they're poems. I also feel like I'm trying to tell a story I want them to know. So I'll get responses like, I didn't know that, or, you know. I also feel though that my story is so long ago that I worry about its relevance. To me, it's extremely relevant, but I sometimes worry about what people will, you know, if they'll think that it matters still.
Oh, I think it still matters for sure. It's a beautiful way to connect with a place, and to learn the history, but to also see things that haven't changed. Yeah.
I do see a site here about have you had collaboration with tribes? And I have not, but I would love that. That would be great.
Someone's asking, did you see the Seattle Times article a few years ago about a visit to the Hanford reactor by a survivor of the bomb in Nagasaki?
Yes, I did. Yeah. In fact, I think Steve Olson, who's on the site, I think he was actually present for that visit. It's very moving. And I remember visiting, I have a very close friend who teaches at Richland High School, or did, and I can't remember if this was his experience or one of his teaching friends' experiences, but they had a number of years ago, this is probably more like 15 or 20 years ago, they had a delegation from Nagasaki or Hiroshima come and visit Richland and then visit the high school. And at that time, there was this visible presentation next to the library of the shadows of children, it's just, it's a visual thing. But they had already walked through the main floor where there's a big inlaid bomb in the middle of the mixing area of the high school. And, people are, it's like there's these bomb motifs everywhere and the mushroom cloud. And so they're very shocked. So by the time they get upstairs and they see the library and they see these shadow children, they're thinking of the shadows and in Nagasaki and Hiroshima of those children, people that were, vaporized by the bomb. And they think this is part of that. And so one of the teachers had to step forward and say, no, that was not intended by this, but you can understand why they would have that confusion. It's kind of boggles the mind, but that's what you're dealing with.
Yeah. How do audiences of scientists respond to your poetry or presentations? It strikes me as a good way to get past the wall of supposed objectivity.
Well, I have to say one very proud moment is when I was asked to go speak to the Society of Civil Engineers. And I brought the poem Plume with me, and I brought, I think, one other a poem I have called Flowchart. And I read those and I explained the form and how I had come up with it. And they just loved it. They loved the language. They loved the way I had designed the poem. It was very designed, very engineered poem. And so that was a great experience for me. I'll never forget that. Very, very rarely does my engineering background and my poetry background come together like that. So it's very exciting when it does.
Yeah, well, thank you for explaining the design of that poem, because I was not aware of it, and it just adds so much depth to the poetry. Of the form is so important as well.
Yeah, well, it is. And, you don't need, as a reader, you don't need to know any of that. You don't need to be aware of any of those things.
But it adds layers.
But it's kind of fun for you to realize that the poet is thinking about those things and is thinking about the message and the information that they want that poem to carry. And they don't want it all to be carried by the words. They want the form to carry some of it too. Mm-hmm. I have to say too, that in my book, Plume, I don't remember how many pages, 3 pages, 2 pages of notes. So another thing, I didn't want to burden those poems with too much of the background history, but I did want the history to be noted. So I have, most poetry books do not have extensive endnotes, but mine does. And that's, so you can kind of carry the weight of information. Poetry should be shelved in the fiction fiction section. Poetry is fiction. A poem might feel true, but it isn't necessarily true. But in this case, when I was writing these poems, I wanted them to be meticulously true. I wanted all the science to be correct. I want it to be accurate as closely as I could make it.
That's great. Have you kept in touch with other engineers, scientists with whom you worked on site? Do you have a sense of how site workers from that time think about the place?
Well, I have a little bit. So I did hear a few years ago, I heard from an engineer that I had worked for. He was my mentor. And it was wonderful to hear from him. And he told me something that I was really moved by. He said, so I had worked, one of the reasons I talked about how difficult it was to get information when I was working at Hanford was because I was tasked with creating a water balance for the 200 areas. So we knew where the water was coming in, but we didn't know where it was going out. And clearly it was coming out a lot because we had this giant mound, and the mound is a problem because it pushes the water towards the river faster than it would go otherwise. So I was tasked with trying to find leaks and, unknown streams and things like that. And I just had, maybe it's partly because I was a woman. I was like 23 or 4 years old. I mean, those could have been issues, but there's just this built-in resistance to sharing information. And so when I was talking, I got this note from my long ago mentor, and he said, I always felt so terrible about, that you actually did a good job on the water balance. You did as good a job as you could have. And I'm sorry it didn't get used more, but it was actually very touching, because I felt at the time, I really felt like it was a failure, because there was so much information I couldn't get. And it was too bad.
Yeah.